Hello and welcome to Season 3, Episode 5 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I'm Mark Bishop.
We are, of course, reading The Power of Myth, a conversation between the mythologist Joseph Campbell and the journalist Bill Moyers that was recorded in the late 80s. This time we are discussing the chapter on sacrifice and bliss, kind of moving on from the last chapter when we talked about the first storytellers and how myths began, and going into sort of how myths are lived out in our daily lives, I would say, is kind of the general theme of this chapter in a way.
Yes. Speaking of living out myths in real life, how was the Thor movie? That was a myth.
Yes, the Thor was a myth. Yes, good job.
You went to the movies tonight without me.
Yes. Well, you did not want to go. It's not like we left you.
True. I was not a band.
Yeah, it was a decent movie. It's the first, I think it's the first Marvel character to get like a fourth individual movie.
He's had 3 movies already?
He's had 3. Yeah, there's Thor the Dark World, Thor Ragnarok, and Thor Love and Thunder. It was okay. It was pretty good. I mean, it was funny. It was entertaining. It was not as good as the last one, Thor Ragnarok, which was really good. Probably one of the best Marvel movies. Hard to follow that one.
I heard the rock guy was gay.
The rock guy was gay. Yes, the man made of rocks. Turns out he is gay in that movie. That has so little to do with the podcast here.
They had to fit it in.
Yes, you have had to fit it in.
No,
here.
They had to fit it in.
Yes,
just like I'm fitting in their fitting in of things that don't really fit. It's like, why would they have to do that?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, but because they want to.
Yes,
that's why I brought it up in this podcast, because that's what I wanted to.
You are free to do whatever you want on this podcast.
Creative license.
Yes, you have creative license here.
Go ahead.
We should use our creative license to talk about the book that we were discussing.
Right. I was going to go on another tangent.
I'm sure you were.
Completely unrelated.
Yes, of course. Usually is. But yeah, what'd you think of this chapter overall? We'll get into more of the specifics, but it was an interesting one.
Yeah, I liked some of it. I mean, I liked all of it. It's a neat book to read, and it's an interesting conversation. You feel like you're kind of listening in on them as they're just hanging out and talking. So I like that. And he has his mystical philosophy about things, and he really goes into a lot into depth on the practical side of that in this chapter. So I enjoyed it. I don't agree with a lot of it, but that doesn't mean I can't enjoy reading it or listening to it or whatever the case may be.
That is true.
What did you think about it?
I liked it, of course, as you might expect. I usually do like these types of things. But yeah, I think it was neat to hear kind of how he thinks we should apply myths to really our daily lives, and really what we should be focusing on when we practice religion or mythology and that sort of stuff. It was an interesting discussion. Like you said, I didn't agree with all of it, but I liked it. I liked his thoughts.
He had the typical practical advice coming from a university professor. Which is follow your bliss.
Yes.
No matter what it is, follow that bliss.
Yeah, we'll get that into
Don't
that.
just pay your bills or do things that are productive. You must follow your bliss.
Yeah, we'll get into that philosophy at the end here. That's kind of the last thing he mentioned. So a little preview of your thoughts on that, I suppose. But he started off really kind of carrying on from where we left off last time. He goes in and he talks about the environment, because that was one of his big things in the last chapter, how environment shapes mythology. And he kind of repeats that here, this huge impact on mythology.
It's a good thing that at that time they were confused as to what was going to cause this catastrophe. At the time, they were thinking it might be global cooling. So I'm sure he would have been on the global warming, climate change bandwagon for real, because he's like, the Earth is a spirit and stuff.
Yes, most likely. He goes on to talk. I really like what he says. Here he talks about
sanctification of the local landscape. You really like that?
No, I was going to say kind of what he sees as the importance of sacred spaces that connect us with spiritual thinking. He says, that used to be all of nature. All of nature essentially used to be the sacred space, but now that we're in these big cities and that sort of stuff, we need designated locations.
I don't. First of all, I don't grant that premise. I don't think that the Native Americans thought everything was sacred. I think there was a lot of scary places, and I'm pretty sure wherever they pooped, they did not consider sacred.
Perhaps so. But I like what he says here on page 115. He says, this is an absolute necessity for anybody today. You must have a room or a certain hour or so a day where you don't know what was in the newspapers that morning. You don't know who your friends are. You don't know what you owe anybody. You don't know what anybody owes to you. This is a place where you can simply experience and bring forth what you are and what you might be. This is the place of creative incubation. At first you might find that nothing happens there, but if you have a sacred place and use it, something eventually will happen. And I think there's some truth to that. I think there's 100%. A lot of truth to that. Yeah. Especially, he's saying this in the 80s. now, 40 years down the line, when we are literally connected to all of the world at all times, and a thing that we can hold in our hands, I think,
right.
it's especially important nowadays just to have a place or have a time of day where you can just shut out all of that and just kind of think, just be to yourself, use that time for prayer and stuff like that, just to kind of get out of everything that is trying to distract you.
I've often thought that, like people that I know that are always like anxious or always or those people that are super sensitive about everything. I often thought that, they should just go into a dark room or just a comfortable room by themselves with nothing in there and just think, and just let their mind wander. And I think a lot of, I guess a lot of people don't do that because they get so, turned around with their own particular worries and issues and stuff. They never actually think about them and put things in perspective and prioritize them.
I also think it's an issue, like, especially now with like smartphones and everything. I think a lot of people consider that as the escape from reality. Let me flip through my phone, flip through Instagram, flip through Twitter, and it'll just be a break from everything else. But I think like that's almost more harmful than just sitting in the real world, because now you're inundated with all the headlines and all the nonsense that's going on outside of you. And it's like, I really don't think that's a break from anything if you're sitting there scrolling through your phone. I think that's much worse.
No, and nobody ever feels better after scrolling through social media. Nobody ever thinks, I feel so much better about myself and about what's going on in my world after spending an hour on social media. It's always, oh man, I just wasted an hour of my life. Every time. I mean, is there ever a time, because you're not, I don't think you're on social media that much, but it's horrible. And it's horrible that we allowed our kids to get into this. And I'm very much a libertarian, but I'm 100% on board with regulating them to death. Outlawing them even. We can figure out a way to do it. Yeah. But especially for minors, nobody under 18 should have a social media account. Yeah. Period.
Yeah, I try to stay away from it as much as possible. Either just do other stuff and spend my time that way. But I'll sit down at, when I have a break throughout the day, and I'm like, I'll just check Instagram, see what my friends are doing. Then I kind of wake up 45 minutes later. I'm like, where did that time just go? I was just scrolling through nothing. I did not learn anything. I did not gain anything from this.
And it's such a big business. They're studying on how to get, and I have deleted the only social media I really used was Facebook, and I've deleted the app. So all I have it on is a browser, but I can still check in on it because, it's like local news, actually. I mean, you don't even know what's going on in the world, but it'll send me emails, and I've sent them to my junk folder and had it, but somehow it gets to my inbox still. There's something going on there. They're stalking me because they want me to get back in. I just won't do it. Yeah. So, but I mean, I'm not deleting it altogether. I've deleted it altogether a couple times. And I'm leaving it alive just to stay in touch with people, I guess. But nothing good comes of it.
Yes, true.
It's horrible. It's evil.
Yeah.
And I think he would agree with us.
Oh, absolutely.
That
I think he would. Joseph Campbell, particularly, as much as he's go out in nature and experience that sort of stuff, he would hate the technological advances we've made now.
He hates. It seems like he really doesn't like cities and buildings, and I think he would agree with. There's some neoconservative thinkers now that are really into architecture as part of society. Yeah. And really looking at how living in a city that's just utilitarian is dehumanizing.
I think that's a good segue into what he says here, because he says, humans build these sacred sites to designate what is of the most importance to them. Yep. Those are usually the tallest buildings in the city. So he says, first that was the cathedrals, then it became the government buildings, and now it's the office buildings. So he says,
or
we could
casinos.
Or casinos, yeah. Now he says we could really trace the spiritual to the political to the economic, and that's really where we've kind of come today. Is we've gotten away from the spiritual, and it's just economics is what's most important in the city now.
Right. Yep. I'm with him.
Yep.
I'm with him on that one.
He then goes on to talk about, he reminisces on a church that he particularly likes, and he likes to go in there and look at the artwork on the walls. And so he kind of brings up the idea of, is that just living in the past, or, what can we gain from this? And he says, the Roman Catholicism of his childhood brings him a lot of nostalgia. And so Moyers asked Campbell if it's really just the past that moves him. He says, it's also the present. The church connects them to the spiritual information of the world. So really, we're not just looking back in the past and, this is stories from long ago. It's, again, that idea of we can use this today and bring this into the present now. And then he brings up an interesting idea. He says that even though we know the whole Mass by heart, we still go. And so Moyers asks him, why keep going to the cathedral then? Campbell responds, that's the whole business of myth. Why do we like to talk about these things again? Because it puts us back in touch with the essential archetypology of our spiritual life. Going through a ritual day after day keeps you on the line. Moyer says, but we don't do that now. And Campbell responds, we've lost touch with that kind of concern. The goal of early life was to live in constant consciousness of the spiritual principle. So that's really kind of building up off of, what's the tallest building around. I think that's just another example of that. It's like very few people ever consider really the spiritual impact of their actions or what they're doing from day to day.
Well, and I would have I have a nit to pick. The reason why in those communities the cathedral or the church was the largest building is because they had a law. They generally had local rules that would not allow anyone to build anything bigger than the church.
Yeah. Well, I know there's a law.
Now, granted, the laws are a reflection of the society's values, but that makes a big difference. You'll notice in different cities.
Well, there's a law in D.C. that nothing can be taller than I forget which building it is. But I think it's one of the monuments. It might be the Jefferson Memorial. I might be getting them mixed up, but no building can be taller than that in Washington, D.C.
And you see, you end up with better livable space, except for, like Manhattan, you only have so much space. But the municipalities that are really assertive about those kind of regulations, you end up having a better livable space. And I like I said, I was a libertarian, but when it comes to some of this municipal stuff and regulation for your living space, it's kind of like similar just to have like speed limits and appropriate traffic laws. You got to have just something that but then again, you own the property. Maybe you should be able to do what you want to. But anywho, but I think he's right. It's important to have a certain sacred space. Of course, that would be church. But he gets away from that because he's like a Native American mystic or something now. He's his own shaman.
Yeah, he kind of gets into that. That's the next notes I have here about the supernatural. He says, the supernatural is the same as the natural. To believe that the supernatural is above the natural is a killing idea. So he says that the spirit is not breathed into life, it comes out of life. So this is really going back to his whole idea that really nature is the sacred space. When we talk about the spirit, when we talk about the soul, that's really nothing different than it kind of is talking about the body, I think is kind of what he would say here. So it's really just one and the same, to be at one with all the universe and in the earth,
he's
essentially.
An animist, so of course animist is going to say that. Hey, going back, he's referencing like in Greenland, like how they have it designed.
Iceland,
that's right. 432,000 Roman feet measurements. What's the significance of that? He mentions that it's very significant. I don't know anything about it, but
yeah, I don't know off the top of my head, but that is what that's an interesting point. Kind of what you're referencing there is he says, Iceland as a whole, all of their settlements were in a relationship of 432,000 Roman feet to each other because 432,000 is a very significant mythological number. I don't know what the significance is.
I thought with you being a myth expert, you'd know.
Yeah. Well, I am not. I wish I was a myth expert, but I don't know that one. But yeah, so that's kind of what he brings back to, we should really kind of plan in accordance to have those spiritual places. But of course, he says, really the utmost important, spiritual space is nature. It's kind of interesting what he says here. He says that the fall in the garden, referencing, Christianity, sees nature as corrupt.
Wait, I'm going to interrupt again.
Yes.
And I think he's completely wrong on how modern society doesn't have these sacred spaces. They're churches. I don't know where he lived, but here in Jefferson County, Missouri, you can't throw a rock without hitting some sort of church. I mean, there are non-denominational churches. There's all sorts of Baptist churches. There's a couple of Catholic churches and Lutherans and everything else. Those are sacred spaces within the modern religious experience. And so he denigrates that, I think. He devalues that and says, well, it should be your natural space. Okay, well, that's great for you and for what you believe, but we also have a ton of natural space. If you want to get some sort of, spiritual experience from that, you can all over the place.
Yeah.
The United States is fantastic about natural preserves. But anyway, I just wanted to say that rant because that kind of rubbed me the wrong way.
Well, I think
talking about, if you want to look for it, if you want to find a sacred space, you're going to find it. They're all over the place.
Yeah. But I think I would say his gripe is more that people aren't looking for them. Is
I
what I
agree
guess
with
he
that.
would say.
Yeah,
In our
okay.
society,
Yeah,
not enough
sure.
people are looking for those.
Well, I don't know. I mean, well, yeah, I guess.
He kind of goes on. This kind of relates directly to what you were saying. Again, I was referencing what he says about Christianity. He says, the fall in the garden sees nature as corrupt, creating a different civilization than those who see nature as a manifestation of divinity. And so this is really where he's kind of, I would say, not really overtly disparaging of Christianity, but he's definitely saying more along the lines that we should look at these, natural religions more than these, others that see, nature as less than humanity.
He wants it to be less a logical, intellectual exercise and more of a feeling, mystical experience, as opposed to a reasoned contemplating of morality and spirituality.
Yeah,
he's not a logic-based religious type guy.
Yeah, he's very much I mean, we'll get into that here in a little bit, but it's really do what feels right, do what you feel called to do is really his sort of overall, I guess, religious or spiritual teaching. We'll get into that when he talks about bliss.
Some of the most dangerous things you can advocate in large groups.
Yes.
Hey, mob, do what you want. Oh, no, not that. What'd you say? Kill him.
But that's actually kind of what he's saying. That's a good transition into his You've been doing a lot of good transitions into exactly what I want to point out next. But he references this distinction between priests and shamans. He says that priests receive power from a social ordination, and they are tasked with carrying out a ritual in the way that society worships. This is different to shamans, which receive power from a psychological experience and instruct others in the deities of their personal experience. So this is kind of what he's saying is really the difference between a lot of these very natural religions and the more, social-oriented religions is that, the spiritual teachers in these, more modern religions of the West is, they're looking at how can the whole group as a whole sort of build up this societal religion, whereas the more natural religions are
the natural one, they're not religions. There may be a belief system. Those aren't religions.
I don't know what qualifies as a religion.
Well, you have to have some sort of understanding, common understanding of what the world is and what your beliefs are. And I don't know that what he's saying is just
because I don't know if that would qualify because if it's based on
it's too individualistic to be, in my view, a religion.
Yeah,
because I don't think he ever says it's a religion. I think he's talking about these spiritual awakenings, and he's very individualistic, which I respect. But he's saying, well, these shaman will lead you on your own path and follow your individual bliss and all that kind of stuff. Well,
because that's kind of what that's kind of what I was
saying.
It's
all well and good, but man, sometimes you gotta work together,
Yeah.
and if it applies to you, it should apply to everybody. I believe there's certain universal rules.
Yeah, there has to be some amount of moral truth because if we're just going on what this shaman has experienced in his own personal life. Then we're not really going to find the full truth because that's just what one guy experienced on one, spiritual whatever. Kind of have to come together as a whole.
Yeah,
and
I'm just very suspicious of anything shaman related.
Yeah, that surprises me.
I mean, of course, I have my own problems with organized religion, the bureaucracy of it. I mean, we're all sinners.
I think there's definitely a middle ground that has to be met. Absolutely, because.
Yes.
You're not going to find, God or your own spiritual journey by just listening to really whatever the crowd says. But you're also not going to find it,
or what the priest says.
You have to have some sort of free will involved there. You have to find it yourself.
And
but at the same time,
he says is beneficial too. Like the whole feel nature and the spirituality and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, but I was just going to say, but there's also you can't just do whatever you want because chances are that's not the truth. Because, I mean, there haven't been thousands of people thinking about this for you to realize that you are correct and you alone.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and on the one hand, he has this belief that there's certain truths that are handed down by these myths and these stories, and these articulated beliefs that are somehow universal, like cross-cultural. But then he has like an individualistic idea of what you should do and how you should believe it, how you should practice it. And in some ways, I think that's a little inconsistent.
Yeah. Well, I think
what if the rules of the Catholic Church are what has been handed down? And I mean, I'm not saying it's necessarily true, but what if all the structured thing is the one true way?
Yeah.
I mean, he would reject that.
What he would, I guess, say to that is, the reason we have so many connections is biological. it's not passed down so much in that we have stories, and stories that are true and that sort of thing. It's that just innately, as humans, we have those images
like
that
a
resonate.
tuning fork. And then we all go, boo. We're all in harmony.
Exactly.
Because it's all in it. You can just visualize it. Like somebody has this spiritual tuning fork. Bing! And then, bing! And then everybody's little tuning fork goes off. And then off the cliff we go, like lemmings.
I think that is the most ridiculous thing I think I've ever heard you say on this podcast.
I don't think that's true.
Yeah, maybe not. But it's up there. It's up there. But yeah, I think what he would say is, it's biological, not intellectual.
Yeah.
But then he makes an interesting distinction in that he says that hunting cultures have shamans, whereas farming cultures have priests.
Yeah, I thought that was really a cool point.
And I think that's absolutely true.
Right.
I think, that's pretty much proven in the hunting cultures that we see that do have the individual rather than the societal.
Right.
Because, the hunt, his reasoning is that, the hunt is individual. When you go out and you get food, you are on your own and it's up to you. But when you're in a farming society, that has to be the group as a whole has to come together. Everybody does their part. And from that, we get the priests. From the hunting, we get the shamans.
Yeah. And then he I forget where it was at in the book, but he seems to say that the story of Jesus is almost, what do they say, sui generis? Like its own unique story because it's almost a combination of both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's unique in that he has the what do you say, the he calls it the more feminine side, or the
farming
side of it, and the masculine side at the same time. So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting. I'm going to get into that here where he talks about sacrifice. And the first point he really makes when talking about sacrifice is that we have stories everywhere that are pretty consistent, that all center around food springing from the place where an animal was buried or a human was buried. And that's the story of, essentially the staple crop of all kinds of civilizations, whether it's corn or it's coconut or that sort of stuff. And so it really, comes with that is the idea that someone has to die in order for life to emerge. And so, of course, we get the sacrificial rituals that then arise from that idea. And so Bill Moyers then kind of asks, what do these rituals point to? What's kind of the underlying truth here? And Campbell responds, the nature of life itself has to be realized in the acts of life. In the hunting cultures, when a sacrifice is made, it is, as it were, a gift or a bribe to the deity that is being invited to do something for us or to give us something. But when a figure is sacrificed in the planting cultures, that figure itself is the god. The person who dies is buried and becomes the food. Christ is crucified, and from his body the food of the Spirit comes. So this is where he gets into what you were saying about the image of Christ and really, what Jesus did here, because it's really, what he's saying is it's really rooted in a very, plant-based, tradition. He's nailed to a tree and that sort of thing, and it relates back to the Garden of Eden and the forbidden fruit.
Right.
But then you also get that very individual aspect of it is, one God coming down and sacrificing himself that can kind of relate more to those hunting cultures. So it is interesting how he combines those two, his two theories there into one in the image of Jesus.
Right.
Which is fascinating. He then also says, kind of applying it more to the personal life, he says that in order to transcend, you must die to the flesh and be born to the spirit. He kind of goes on to say that death and life are just two aspects of being. And then he goes on to say that many cultures celebrated sacrifice because they truly saw it as bringing new life. It was an honor to be sacrificed, which is...
Then he talks about the Mayans.
Yeah.
Because, the native people and the Mayan people were morally superior to the Western, colonialists. They had basketball games, which at the end, the captain of the winning team was sacrificed in the field by the captain of the losing team. Of course, you're like, well, why is the winner getting sacrificed? Well, because he earned it.
Yes, because it's such an honor to be killed.
Yeah.
Yes.
Golly, gee whiz. People are like, we need to get back to our natural roots, and the Mayans, they were at one with nature. No, they weren't. They were murderers. They were horrible. It's a horrible society.
Yes.
They're like, well, let me show you. I don't ever want to make those references. They're worse than the communists. Okay, that's how bad they were historically. They had thousands of human sacrifices, thousands and thousands.
I
they
think
would sacrifice babies. They were horrible.
Yes.
No modern equivalent. No Western equivalent.
Yeah.
Period.
I think any belief system that requires you to kill somebody in order for you to get food is not a belief system that should really be upheld. That's my hot take of the night. Yeah.
Right. The only caveat to that is on an individual level, if it was necessary to live, then maybe you have a defense, but it's still not sought after. Not morally, legally, maybe it would be allowed, but it's not necessarily even morally, you know? Yeah. But I do enjoy his examples of the Mayans, and then he has the northeastern Indians ritualized systematic torturing of people that they capture, other Indians, because they were those are Native Americans, and you're supposed to feel guilty, Adam. Do you remember that we were supposed to feel guilty from the last podcast, from the last author?
Yes.
Because of how poorly those Native Americans were treated, because they were morally superior to us, even though they did systematic torture of their captives, which were not only legal, so to speak, in their system, but celebrated.
Yes.
All right. The end of rant.
You're forgetting, Dad, that it's an honor to be sacrificed. Yes. So therefore it is moral. Yes. So.
And he even mentions how the at the time, we only know the stories because there were French missionaries there trying to convert them, and they were aghast. They were horrified. Yes. And he's like, "Oh, those stupid Frenchmen didn't understand." They were in the room, dude. And they're just like, "Oh, please don't torture me next."
He then goes on to the idea of self-sacrifice here, and he tells a really neat story about some policemen, and I kind of want to read the story here, because I like this. He says, one day, 2 policemen were driving up the Poly Road when they saw, just beyond the railing that keeps the cars from rolling over, a young man preparing to jump. The police car stopped, and the policeman on the right jumped out to grab the man, but caught him just as he jumped. And he was himself being pulled over when the second cop arrived in time and pulled the 2 of them back. Do you realize what had suddenly happened to that policeman who had given himself to death with that unknown youth? Everything else in his life had dropped off. His duty to his family, his duty to his job, his duty to his own life. All of his wishes and hopes for his lifetime had just disappeared. He was about to die. Later, a newspaper reporter asked him, "Why didn't you let go? You would have been killed." And his reported answer was, "I couldn't let go. If I had let that young man go, I couldn't have lived another day of my life." How come? He then goes on to describe this in terms of sort of the belief system of Schopenhauer, one of the philosophers that I think we covered in the first season of the podcast. But he kind of says that, this sort of psychological crisis represents a metaphysical realization. You and the other are one. And so he says, our true reality is in our identity in unity with all life. He says the hero is the one who has given his physical life to realize that truth.
Yeah, man, it's a bunch of bullshit.
Yeah,
this was a good man who had a sense of duty and responsibility for another person, and it's not about it's duality and we're both the same people. No, it was his job as he saw it to do the right thing to try to save this man's life, and it took him over the rail. He's going to take him over the rail, and I think it denigrates this guy's statement that he couldn't live with himself if he let this guy die without trying everything. And man, that's a good deal. There's a story this last week. I forget where it was at, somewhere here in the United States. Guy was driving down the street and he saw houses on fire, so he burns out, turns around 180. It's in the middle of the night. He goes in there. There's like 5 kids in there. He wakes them up. He gets 4 of them out. The house is engulfed in flames. He climbs back up there because there's one little baby left. And there's body cam video of him when he comes out of the smoke and fire with this little baby in his arms. And they're trying to give him oxygen to take the baby away, and he just says, God, tell me the baby's gonna be okay. That's all I need to know. The baby's okay. He didn't even know these people. I don't even think he lived in the area. And then they're calling him a hero and stuff. He says, "Look, I'm not a hero." He says, "I just did what I expect anybody else to do, any other man to do in that situation." Boy, those are the perfect words for the way men should be handling themselves in a situation like that. Don't just pick out a phone, pick up your phone and videotape a crisis. Get in there and do it. And I think that's the real lesson, and it's part of a martial almost philosophy of life, as opposed to necessarily spiritual. Maybe it's part spiritual, but it's not this mysticism that we're all the same. It's a sense of duty. I mean,
I would argue. Yeah, I agree. I would argue that it's not because we see that other person as one and the same as us. I would argue it's because we see that life is unique, and that is another person who has something to add to really the big picture of all that life is.
Yeah, I think even that's a little bit
You think so?
overstating it, because I think it's just what you need to do to be a good person in those circumstances. And if you can conceive of it now, who knows what any of us are going to do in an extreme situation, because maybe you just run away or something, because who knows until it happens. But I mean, these guys that do those things, and women too, they're making a decision that they're willing to sacrifice themselves for that other person because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
It's almost it's a duty, especially a police officer.
Yeah.
Because they feel that's their job. They kind of signed up for it, I guess. But
I guess if you really kind of want to go a little bit deeper than that, I mean, why do we have that duty? Then I would argue it is because we recognize that life is sacred and as unique.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that is
right.
what the guy is thinking,
Right.
like, oh, this life is, but I'm saying that, underlying
right.
that idea of, it's not the idea that we are all one and the same. It's the idea that life is unique and has value.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Is they have already built that in to their belief system on a day in and day out basis, and this is just what happens when somebody with that belief system that truly holds it firmly is presented with that crisis or opportunity. Yeah, I don't see it as like, well, we're all one being and I'm giving of myself. No, it's just something you got to do because that's what you do when you're doing a good thing.
Yes, I agree.
And I think that's why he wouldn't be able to live with himself, because he wouldn't have been the same guy. He wouldn't have been who he thought he was.
Yes.
He thought he was a person that would grab onto a guy trying to kill himself to save him. And if he would have let go, he would let go of that concept of himself as a good person. And I don't know if he would have been able to live with himself.
Yeah.
Somebody that's that good and that meaningful and devoted, it's a huge crisis of confidence if they don't do it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I absolutely agree. To get back to what Campbell kind of says here, he makes an interesting
love your neighbor because he's yourself.
Yes, that's what
philosophy.
I was gonna.
Oh, come on.
Yes, because he says
because they're not me. I have this problem.
Like, can I just explain what he's saying here
Okay,
before you get into this? Because what he's saying is he, of course, pulls up the saying by Jesus, love thy neighbor as thyself. He says what that really means is love thy neighbor because he is yourself, because there's no difference between the me and the you.
Complete bullshit. And I have a big problem with getting this concept in my personal life, because again, I'm noticing it more and more that when I'm out in public, I really do kind of view people as non-player characters in my world, and I don't know how to overcome that. I was in church today, and I'm looking around, and all these people. I mean, I know some of them very well, but a lot of them I don't know other than I see them at church. I never talked to them in my life. I've known them in a sense. I knew who they were for 10 years or more. And I have a real hard time. Like, I don't know. Do you when you see people that you have never talked to, but they're familiar to you, do you immediately, are you thinking of them as, like, what are they thinking? Or do you know what I'm saying? How do you view people that when you're in a crowd?
Yeah. Well, I think it's weird because I've been working retail the whole summer.
Yes.
I've been working customer service. And so what I do is I deal with everybody's issues.
Yeah.
And so really, the only thing that I think when I deal with people is, okay, how do I get them to calm down first and foremost?
Right.
And it's not really, okay, what are they thinking? What is their thought process behind this? It's, okay, what can I do to get them in the direction that they want? And how can I get them to calm down so I can actually figure out what the problem is? But yeah, in general, like in crowds, I don't, it's so hard to see because there's just so many people.
Yeah, right.
It's like,
so maybe I feel I'm starting to get worried about myself as I'm some sort of sociopath. But I'm hoping that I'm not like abnormal in that way. I mean, the people that I know, those are individuals.
It's like I look at them and I understand that, well, that person must have their own thoughts and their own ambitions and everything, but I don't ever think about what those are, I think is the distinction there.
Yeah, well, yeah. And I mean, if I stop and I ask, or like very much like a video game, if they approach me and they say something to me, all of a sudden, oh, okay, this is a real person, Is that weird? Or
I don't think it is.
Okay,
because when I'm standing up there,
I'm starting to get worried about myself.
Yeah, because the customer service desk is right there by the main entrance to the place I work, and so I see dozens of people
they just walk by.
and they just walk by, and I just
Okay.
Well, they're here to shop, and that's
Yes,
it, and that's the end of my thoughts about them. Yeah.
All right, very good.
Yes.
Now I don't feel so bad. I'm starting to get worried. Like I said, some sort of social. But I used to work retail too, and maybe that's had something to do with it.
Yeah.
It's like,
It's like you almost have to detach yourself from the situation
right.
sometimes. It's like, okay, this person isn't yelling at me. They're yelling at the whatever situation happened to them, made up or real.
Back to what he was saying, that's not what Jesus was saying, that love your neighbor because they are you. That's not at all. That we're all into now. Ultimately, we're all part of God, but I'm not you and you're not me. We might all be God, but we're not each other. Yeah. I don't think there's anything in Christian philosophy that says that you're me and I'm you. Hugh? You're Hugh?
Oh.
No, I am you. Yeah. I am Hugh. You or me? No.
Yes, but I agree.
What's Up, Doc? Yes. The movie with the best movie with Barbara Streisand.
Yes, I'm
the
familiar.
Only good movie with Barbara Streisand. No, that's not true. There's that one. I was going to say Lentil, but I think it's Yentl.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a movie.
Thanks, that clears it up. But yeah, I agree with what you're saying there. We're very, very different from each other. He then goes into some ideas about Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. Yeah. I thought this was interesting because he pulls essentially the three major ideas throughout history of why Jesus had to die on the cross. The first is that he says that the original sin had committed humanity to the devil, and to win back humanity, God had to offer his own son as redemption. So that's the redemption idea. The second is that God was so offended by the original sin that the only thing that could atone humans with God was a sacrifice that was equal to the importance of the sin. So that's atonement. And then the third, he points to the medieval thinker Abelard, whose idea was that Christ came to be crucified to evoke in man's heart the sentiment of compassion for the suffering of life, and so to remove man's mind from blind commitment to the goods of this world. It is in compassion with Christ that we turn to Christ, and the injured one becomes our Savior. So he kind of says that, by contemplating the cross, we contemplate the mystery of life. And that's really what he thinks is really the real reason, how many times can I say real there, of why Jesus had to die. It was so we could awaken that compassion within us and understand that, death has to come with life. In order to understand things. I don't know. What's your take on this? Why did Jesus have to die on the cross?
Oh, gosh. How do I know?
Yeah.
That's one of the things I really struggle with. And I mostly struggle with how to articulate it.
Well, I know the kind of what I think, but I don't know if this is necessarily what I was taught in theology class, but generally what we know about, Jesus' death was that, essentially was kind of the, I don't know if bargaining chip is the right word here, but it essentially was the counterweight to all of our sins. So all of our sins are forgiven because Jesus died on the cross. And so the way that I understand it is, the reason why God had to come down and become mortal and that sort of thing was because, it's essentially infinite sin. And so what is the cost of infinite sin would have to be an infinite life, essentially. So that is why God, as Jesus, had to come to earth and die. Because that is the only sacrifice that is equal to all of the sins that humanity has ever done.
We're going to have a different podcast season on Catholic philosophy or something.
You think so?
Well, yeah, because this is a big subject. I have a hard time with this. As you know, I have a hard time with the original covenant, Abraham being told to sacrifice his son. I had a big problem with that. And issues with it, I guess I should say. And then I also have a hard time understanding and articulating, what do they call it, the transfiguration, for the communion and stuff, which is related to this. And I just think I'm going to pass.
You think you're going to pass? You're not going to offer any thoughts? You're not going to counter any of my thoughts?
Well, I don't like the infinite life. I don't see that as a bargaining or an exchange.
Yeah, I didn't articulate it right, but I do think there is the idea in there of how much is the weight of all of the sins ever, and how do you rectify that? I think it would have to be with something of that equal weight. I don't know if it's necessarily a bargain. I don't buy into the idea that original sin committed us to the devil, and I don't buy into the idea that God was so upset at us for original sin that he cast us out, essentially.
Yes, I agree with you on those. And I think it kind of, there's a lot of paradoxes in here, contradictions, because the sacrifice is not ours, but it's for our benefit.
Yeah.
And there's a covenant, but why aren't, I guess Abraham made the first covenant or whatever, but so it kind of calls back to that. But why didn't it not happen? Like Abraham's sacrifice didn't happen. You know what I'm saying? It's
I don't know, it's almost like if you combine all three of those and take out some parts of them, somewhere in there you get close to the right answer. But I don't think any of these necessarily are right on their own.
Yeah,
these three ideas.
That's one of the things I've been contemplating on those other two subjects too, and I'm not prepared to really.
Yeah, neither am I. I mean, clearly.
But
yeah, it's definitely something to think about. He then goes on to say that we must suffer the pain of death to the world in order to truly live. And he goes on to say, we don't have that idea of self-sacrifice in church anymore. He kind of goes on to say, we go to church because it's a social gathering. We like the people there. We don't really think about it. And he says, when we really see that sacrifice is in times of war or in working for one's family and motherhood and these other things. This is mostly examples that Bill Moyers kind of gives here. And, where do we see these actual everyday self-sacrifices? And he says, the man who waits on the subway stop every single morning and he hates going to work, but he knows that he has to provide for his family.
Moyers is onto something there.
Yes, I think he is.
I think that Campbell glosses over because I think that is more, I don't know. Well, I call it the grind. Like in order for you to have decent kids and you to have success in your marriage and with your children and your family, you have to do the grind. And the grind sucks. Especially sucks when you're in your 20s. You know, when you're young, and especially if you have friends that don't have young kids and they're, hey, let's go out to the winery and stuff. Oh man, I can't. I got to take care of Sam and Adam, man. I can't go to the winery. I don't have any money. I'm spending it all on diapers and all this kind of stuff. But you don't, you may say that, but you don't really regret it. That's the key is that you're choosing it.
And I get some of that. I mean, going back to my pretty sucky job at the moment, of course, this is not a very good sacrifice for anything really worthwhile. But I mean,
it's a different
idea.
It's a completely different concept.
But I can see where you're coming from because I do not like going into work every day. It is not a fun experience. It's not the same thing. I get it.
That's not even close.
All right.
That's like one. That's a blink. It's a blink. When you have, because in a couple of weeks you're done, you're going back to college.
Yes.
Right? That's the difference. The grind is, this is my life. There is no escaping it. I am, like his example was, every day I go down to the subway, I die a little. My soul dies a little doing this, but I'm doing it for the kids. Now, I don't advocate that you have a job that's so crappy that you think you're dying a little every day, but sometimes you kind of have to push through that, and that there is some sacrifice in that. It's not going to war. It's not the once in a lifetime fireman going into a burning building, because they don't go into burning buildings every day.
Yes, I
once
understand.
in a lifetime opportunity for them. Once in a career, twice. If they're lucky.
Yes.
Anyway, that's what he's talking about. That's what I'm talking about. It's not some part-time job you have one summer in college.
Yeah,
but it's the hopelessness. What?
Nothing. Keep going.
Are you laughing about the hopelessness? There's an element of that.
Yes, I understand. It's just
you don't know of it yet. You don't know of it yet. It just wait for it. You'll appreciate it later.
I'm sure I will. Yes, moving on away from, where we see sacrifice in our daily lives. He goes on to, he mentioned some interesting points about the majority, Campbell does. He says, in terms of thinking, the majority is always wrong. He says, reaching God is a purely individual thing. And I think there's definitely some truth and some false, I think, in there. This is kind of what we were talking about earlier, but I think he's kind of spot on when we're talking about, moral thinking. If you just get a group of people together, they're not going to come to the right decision. But I also don't think if you get one person on their own just thinking about morals in general, I also don't think he or she is going to get the right decision either.
The one thing I was always fascinated by, and I always remember about the Tiananmen Square massacre.
Where did this come from? What is the?
They had it was this 1989. They student protests, and it ended up being a big deal. They were later crushed by the army, with the column of tanks coming in and all that kind of stuff. But they set up a democratic system on these protesters that the minority ruled, which I thought was very interesting. And I always If the minority said they're going to stay, they're going to stay, and the minority said they're going to stay, and they stayed. And I just never did understand that.
Yeah.
But anyway, and so like how does it work? How does his idea work that the majority is always wrong?
Yeah.
Now I agree that mob rule is always dangerous, and you shouldn't set up a governmental system that way because it's worse than autocracy.
My thinking is it kind of combines, I guess it all goes back to the individual, I think, is usually wrong in these sorts of things. Because when you have a group of people essentially voting on morality, they're just going to vote for what benefits them directly. That's what I think would really happen.
I'm surprised that he thinks this, because he thinks that there's some innate morality or innate spirituality. And if these myths are fundamental and are in us already, then why isn't it automatic that we all kind of resonate with the right thing? Because, we're all part of the spirit. We're all one. If we all vote, shouldn't we all vote the same? Because we're all the same thing, right? If I'm loving my neighbor as myself, it's because my neighbor is myself. Well, then why don't we all agree on everything? Aha!
Well, his answer,
oh no,
then is where we get the idea of bliss that we've been foreshadowing throughout this episode. But this is really what he's kind of saying is his underlying thoughts here is that in order to truly live, you must follow where your body and soul want to go, and this is following your bliss. So your bliss is essentially your path as determined by what your body and soul want. He says that the economy.
Every pedophile in the country has that on their T-shirt. That's their motto.
Yeah, he says,
"Hey man, I just gotta follow my bliss."
Yeah. He says the economy, politics, war, all of these other outside things drag most people away from their bliss, and we must always keep it as the center. No matter what happens, keep your bliss in mind. He says, the bliss is now. We don't need to wait for heaven to get it. He says, bliss
and I'm being too critical because I think he's talking about bliss as being a spiritual positive. And his counter to my cynical statements are, well, it can't be blissful if you're hurting people. It has to be a spiritual positive activity that helps, whatever. I shouldn't be so critical of him because I really do know what he means. He means it in a positive experience that you're one with nature, and you can't be one with nature or the spirits if you are.
Yeah, because he's really big on, it's very much your individual experience. He says, in heaven, you'll be simply looking at God. That's not your experience. That's you experiencing God, essentially.
Yeah, I wonder if that's true.
Yeah. Might be. But yeah, I definitely think there are some issues with this, way of thinking because, it's like what I've said, earlier is, if you're just listening to what your body and your soul want right now, we do not always want the right thing. We want bad things. We want whatever benefits us in the moment. We want,
or even the long term.
Or in the long term.
Long-term goals may not be right. So yeah, it's dangerous, but I think his advice is correct generally that you should pursue a passion. And it depends on how you pursue it.
I think it also, in some ways, contradicts what he was saying earlier about sacrifice. Because the way he kind of frames it here is it's like, don't worry about your other obligations so much. Worry about what's going forward. He tells it in the story of a dad talking to his kid at a restaurant, and the kid doesn't want to eat the peas or whatever it is. He says, the dad's like, I don't care what the kid wants. In life, you're going to have to do things you don't want to do. I've never done a thing that I've wanted to do in my life.
Right.
So he says,
a little bit of hyperbole there, but it's the grind. He understands the grind.
He understands the grind. Yeah, but I think it's because it's so different from what he was saying earlier and like the sacrifices that we have to make through our lives. And then he kind of almost just completely flips on that.
Correct.
And it's like, follow your bliss. And it's like, I don't see how you can mesh those two together. I think I do see how you can mesh them together, but I don't think he's done it properly. Like, follow your goals, but keep in mind that it'll be a lot of struggles and it'll be a lot of trials to get there.
Correct.
And keep in mind how this is going to impact everyone else around you as well, your obligations to other people.
Right. Sometimes you got to eat your peas.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Because your dad said so.
Yeah, because that's what you have to do.
A nice restaurant, and you paid for those damn peas.
Yes.
You're going to sit down, you're going to eat those damn peas, and you're going to smile.
Did this call back a specific memory?
No.
Okay.
I've never ordered peas.
But yeah, I just don't think he met.
Who orders peas at a restaurant?
Yeah, but I don't think his ideas really mesh too well when he's. You're right. Who does order peas at a restaurant?
They're hard to eat, man. You're trying to eat those with a fork. You're not supposed to eat them with a spoon, I don't think. They can roll all over the place. If you smash them, you look like a Hoosier. If you smash them into a paste, you're like, look at that Hoosier smashing his peas.
Yep. Yep. Sure. Oh my God. Anyway, the last point that Campbell kind of makes in this chapter that I actually liked here, he says that we often have invisible hands helping us along the life that we ought to be living. So essentially he's saying, when you follow your path, you're going to encounter people, you're going to encounter events, and you'll realize later that helped push you in the right direction. And I kind of like this exchange between Moyers and Campbell here at the very end. Moyers asks, have you ever had sympathy for the man who has no invisible means of support? Campbell responds, who has no invisible means? Yes, he is the one that evokes compassion, the poor chap. To see him stumbling around when all the waters of life are right there really evokes one's pity. Moyers responds, the waters of eternal life are right there? Where? And Campbell says, wherever you are, if you are following your bliss, you are enjoying that refreshment, that life within you, all the time. And I think there's some truth to that, and that, somebody who doesn't have those people and those, good events, pushing them in the right direction is a person who's really lost. I think, I guess it also kind of goes back and counters what he was saying earlier, is that it's a purely individual thing.
Right.
And that you do have to have those people around you. You do have to have, you do have to have that support around you. You can't just get there on your own. You have to have those people helping you. And it's the person who has none of that help is really the one who needs to be pitied.
I found that usually people that have no help are jerks.
Really?
Yeah.
How so?
Because that's why they have no help. Because they've been a jerk to everyone.
Yeah.
And no one wants to help them. Nobody wants to spend time with them.
That is a good point.
What do you think about that?
I think that's pretty true.
There's an excellent cynical negative take on every subject.
Yeah. I guess,
and I can think of the best
one.
one.
I guess it's a chicken and the egg sort of situation. There's, well, what if they, grew up in a household where they didn't have that support and that made them a jerk?
Oh, please.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Really?
I mean, I think it's possible.
Yeah,
You guess.
It's also possible that they will realize that they need to be nice to other people. And before you know it, they have 1,000 friends.
That is true. What are your thoughts on this chapter as a whole?
It's getting late and I'm tired now. I'm getting cranky
yes,
and
I can
negative
tell.
and cynical because we're doing this podcast after you've watched Thor, God and Thunder.
Love and Thunder. Yes.
Sounds like a 70s trucker movie.
Had a lot of Guns N' Roses in it.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Like what ones? Paradise City? Sweet Child of Mine?
Yeah, Sweet Child of Mine for sure. Paradise City might have been in there.
Paradise City.
Yeah. I know Paradise City, yes.
That was a good album.
Yeah.
Their debut album.
Yes.
Welcome to the Jungle. Was that in there?
Yeah, it might have been.
Should have been.
Might have been.
It should be in everywhere.
All right. What are your thoughts on this chapter? Not Guns N' Roses.
Thought-provoking. It's good.
Yeah.
It's good. It's a good read.
Yeah.
Good podcast.
I mean, it brings up
talking about it.
Brings up good questions, and the idea of should you do what you want to do, or should you do how do you know what's right? Really, I think is really kind of, I guess that's really the big question he's asking here is how do we know what is right? And I think he answers it in a way that we disagree with for the most part, but I think he answers it well. I think he's very articulate. I mean, we've been saying this every episode, like he's just a very, very smart guy.
Yeah, he seems like a nice person too. He's not trying to sell you some pig in a poke.
Yeah, and he never really bashes on whatever Moyers is saying, even if he disagrees with him. He's saying,
I
can see that, but consider this, essentially. And I think that's really...
He's very specific about his not wanting to criticize organized religion directly, or the Catholic Church in particular. So I appreciate that, because he may have thoughts about that, but he's very careful saying, well, I'm not saying it's bad, or it's just, this is different, and he has a preference, of course, which is fine.
Yes, exactly.
All right.
Any other closing thoughts?
No.
I think I might start designing a T-shirt, maybe. I mean, we have like 3 episodes left in this season.
What's the design of the T-shirt?
I don't know. It might be similar. We might just have a quote on the back. We'll have to think of if we want to do a competition for someone to win the T-shirt. We'll have to think about the quote as well. I liked yours a couple episodes ago. I'm fed up. I'm about to start caring. Or maybe we should do something about peas, because he has such a passion for peas.
That's a one-off.
That is a one-off.
That's a theme.
Yeah.
But I do have that. I have that recurring. That's more of my philosophy of life right now. I'm fed up. I'm about to start caring.
It's a good one.
I had to. I'm going to go on an aside that I was going to go on earlier, but I'm going to
Sure,
do it.
go for it.
Do it.
Go for it.
So as an attorney, you have to have it. You have to have training.
Oh no, not this aside. I know where this is going.
Never mind.
No,
It's
please tell the audience.
Unrelated.
Please tell
the audience.
Well, now it's a letdown.
I was so offended. So we have to have implicit bias training. Because they come out and say it in every one of these stupid things that it's unconscious, so you can't help it. It's unconscious bias. You cannot help it, and you're not at fault for it because it's just what people do. But let's talk about how you can overcome it. What kind of nonsense is that? And I'm so offended by it. I'm about to care enough where I'm going to have to design my own implicit bias training, which will have to comply with their requirements so I can be a presenter, basically. It's unpaid. It's basically attorneys volunteer for, whatever. This was a particular organization of attorneys at a conference, and some, these people volunteer their time to help out the group of us, and it's great. And so I don't need to be overly critical of the left-wing lunatic that did this session this time. But I think I need. I'm just so fed up. I'm going to have to start doing stuff about it. I don't have time to care about these things. But I think there's a lot of people like me that are like, oh God, all right, fine. You're forcing me.
Yes.
And so that's like my new philosophy of life. Oh, I'm so fed up now. I have to care.
Yes. I see.
So
that is a good philosophy to have. I think that is.
Oh no, it's not. It's so.
I'm so sorry. That's not a good philosophy to have.
Well, it's a bad situation to be in.
Yeah.
It's like you don't want to have to do it.
But
it's like somebody has to step up, and this is dangerous territory in the modern world. So if I actually put this together, because it's going to have all their buzzwords, but it's going to have the arguments against their buzzwords within the training program. But I'll explain what the buzzwords mean. I'll explain what implicit bias is. And the bottom line conclusion, I agree with them on this, in that everybody's to be treated as an individual.
Yes.
Period.
Yes.
And that's it. But when you start saying, well, you can't say anything about a paddy wagon. Do you know why you can't say anything about a paddy wagon?
I don't.
Oh, you don't know? Because in Boston and New York, the Irish would get so drunk, they'd come by with the big horse-drawn carriage that was like a big box with a lock in the back, and they'd throw all these paddies, all these Irishmen in the back of the paddy wagon and take them to jail because they're a bunch of drunks. Nobody knows that.
Yeah.
And the Irish, if anything, would celebrate it now. I'm Irish. I think it's cool. So it's like, you get so far removed. And like, you can't say somebody's a chief of police now. Why? Because it's appropriating the culture of Indians because you have a chief. Like, how is that bad? And our entire society is built on cultural appropriation. The melting pot. Yes. And, it's offensive. It's wrong. It's illogical. And they've indoctrinated all the professors and all the new lawyers in law school. And now they're trying to get us. They're trying to get the other over 40 crowd because we don't know all this stuff. Well, we know it. We reject it. Right? It's now that we don't know it. We know about your microaggressions, which by definition are so small, nobody gives a shit about them. It's a microaggression. What that mean? It means it's not even aggressive. It's passive.
Yes. Anything else you'd like to add on this episode?
So now I'm so fed up, I got to start caring.
I was going to say it's better than I'm fed up, I'm not going to care anymore. I think that's a better...
It's healthier. It's healthier to say I just don't care. I give up.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't think that is healthier.
I don't know.
All right.
We'll see how it works
I think we're about at the end of this episode.
Yes.
This has been Season 3, Episode 5 of Unlimited Opinions. I've been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.
And you are just walking away. You just took your headphones off and you are out of
I'm
here.
checking out.
Check it out.